there's a little bit of a problem, if it's a problem to you. I'm actually not much of an expert. Really, I'm just another one of those students. They're like maybe 3 rows back, though I'm usually a front row kind of kid. I've been trying to ask the teacher a question for quite some time now. It's a simple question. Why is education so complicated that I'm standing in front of you all to ask this question now? This question came up years ago, back when I was working in Southeast Raleigh. I was doing that millennial thing of all work and no pay internship. Yeah. There was this urban agriculture project. And now this project was started by an organization that claimed this was for the community, but the community didn't start this farm project. And became really curious about this because I was interested in finding a city farm that feeds into the local food system and creates physically and financially accessible healthy foods for folks. Also how America gets away with using the word community so freely. Now, my mentorship, my time in Raleigh was under the mentorship of this guy, Mr. Maurice Small, who, donning a pair of blue sweat-stained overalls and a black t-shirt and French opium perfume, this guy, Mr. Maurice, has already managed to help rebuild or create local food systems all across the country, both in rural and urban areas. Because of his work and his wild mind, he makes for a great teacher. And he's taught me some of the most essential lessons, like the interdependency of plants, but also people, the humility of soil, the power of sharing food with one another, and how food brings us to the table of a much larger discussion. Now, there's other stories too. You know, because when you work in the hot summer sun, in the soil, your body just goes on autopilot. So your mind is allowed to just think, really think of anything. So it would be a given that everyone at the farm would come to learn each other's stories. Stories like, who's got money, who don't got money, who's in school, who skipped that school thing. Stories of prison, who's been to prison, who's still in prison. These stories all started back in school, because it's in school where most things go awry. It was in my time in Southeast Raleigh that I learned of the school-to-prison pipeline, a metaphor to explain the correlation between students who experience disciplinary action in schools and the likelihood of ending up in the criminal justice system. This school-to-prison pipeline developed out of zero-tolerance policies in schools and police presence. Now, zero tolerance implies strict discipline on even petty instances like chewing gum, having a cell phone in class. It forbids authorities to practice discretion, regardless of the severity of the event. Instead, enforces a very self-determined discipline, regardless of the incident. Now, when you punish a child, a young person, a student, you remove them from the classroom. In doing so, you're removing the opportunity to learn, decreasing their academic performance. And when you reduce their academic performance, you're increasing their likelihood of dropping out, decreasing opportunities after school, and statistically speaking, increasing the likelihood of experiencing or going through the criminal justice system at some point. Now, when I got back from Raleigh, and I was in Knoxville, Tennessee, I found out much of the same thing was happening here. In 2014, a federal complaint was filed against the 2012-2013 school year, claiming that black students were 3 times more likely than their white peers to be disciplined, expelled from school. Now, disabled students of color were experiencing even higher rates of discipline. And the news is out about this topic. There are plenty of studies that show that students of color are 3 times more likely to experience suspension or get expelled in school compared to the white peers. 70% of students arrested in schools are either black or Latino. And I bring up these things because while, yes, it is very demonstrative that black students are more at risk, as we say, to receive discipline, it's also the proportionality of it all. The proportionality meaning there are more white students in our schools, and yet students of color are the ones who receive these disciplines, usually more severe disciplines than their white peers. Now, the issue to me was clearly systemic. Behind every symptom, there is a much larger disorder. And what are we doing about this? We see failing schools happening all the time across the country, and programs to help improve a child's academic performance. But really, what does academic performance do for someone if we're not addressing the larger institutional, environmental, and even personal needs of a student, such as emotional security or financial stability? It would be years later that I'd actually end up working in a school. And I brought these observations with me into my work. I started wondering, what can I do as an AmeriCorps VISTA and gardener to address these issues? Because you might argue that a school has no business in these matters. Like, it's the parents that are supposed to take care of these kids. Like, they're supposed to raise them up right. I would argue that if a child is forced to go to school, and let's admit it's kind of forced to go to school, and they spend 8 or more hours a day there, their parents might have to work 1, 2, or 3 jobs just to provide for their child or whatever else. I think the public school system can do a little more in all the school systems. Now, context. I was in the garden. An outdoor classroom is very different than the indoor classroom. Instead of pencils, papers, and personal computers, we have soil, shovels, and seed and sky to work with. It's a little bit different. If you're not used to being outside, around the bugs, around the heat, then there's a bit of a learning curve and high rate of disinterest. So even before I can even engage the students in teaching them and encouraging them to learn in the garden, I had to wonder, what's going to make them even care to be here, let alone learn in the garden? What's going to motivate a child to academically be successful when there's so many other things going on? Because even at an early age, I saw students that I worked with who were already showing signs of just helplessness, defeated. Students who act out or wiggle out to avoid the embarrassment of failure defined by someone else's terms. Students who object to being subjected to someone pushing out another person's way of life. Now, students can be placed in submission in schools. Whether it's lack of interest, lack of challenge, strict discipline, or what I think is most common is just the inability to, and unwillingness to understand and relate and accept a student for who they are. And it's not like schools are very welcoming most of the time, considering that a police officer or school resource officer are the first people to not greet you in a school, but stop you as you walk into the building. And for a student, a school isn't just the extension of a child's life. I mean, a school is the hub of a child's life. So when they come into these institutions, have no say in how they operate, can't feel like they can contribute to the school culture, and under the constant threat of discipline, then how can a child actually learn in these environments? And after working in the classroom, it became apparent to me that maybe the problem isn't the student, the young person, the child, but maybe how institutions see these people. It's similar back in Raleigh, North Carolina. You have these people who have really great intentions. But these great intentions sometimes obscure the ability to actually see people for who they are. Instead, we see ourselves in the people that we're helping. Consequently, schools provide very valuable life skills, but only to the people who live out the white middle-class American way of life. For everyone else, it just doesn't really relate, though. So, yeah. I believe there is a connection in how institutions approach education, how it dissolves and negates the pre-existing definition of a person or people's identity, how this dominant mentality continues to enforce the idea of what is art, what is innovation, what is learning, and what is worth of another people. In 1968, Ivan Illich, a political satirist, gave an address to Peace Corps alum in Cuernavaca, Mexico. He starts out by saying, "Pathway to hell is paved in good intentions." The third largest North American export next to money and guns is the US idealist, who shows up in every theater of the world, whether it's missionary work, volunteer work, economic development, or education. These people see their work as a service to the lesser privileged, but are ultimately vacationing salesmen for the middle-class American way of life. Ivan Illich goes to describe that Peace Corps is really just kind of a cover-up and a Band-Aid for maybe the damage that America has done to other countries, kind of like good PR. Now, why do I bring this up? Because whether it's Peace Corps or the classroom, the mentality is the same. When you walk into an environment that you do not belong in, and you say, I'm going to change your life for the better, what are you really trying to say? That because you're different, therefore you are lesser than them? Or they are lesser than you? Now, everyone needs a little help, sure. But when you walk into someone's home and you say, this place is a mess, and here's a broom, clean it up, it's a little intrusive, isn't it? So why do we feel like we can do that to someone else's school, to a neighborhood, to even another country? Before we can even help people, we also need to get to know them, relate to them, develop a sense of trust and respect. But really just ask them, what do people need help with? Now, I'll admit, I was pretty lousy as an AmeriCorps VISTA connecting and engaging with the neighborhood I was working in, because I approached it the same way that I would approach anything that I was interested in. And because of this, I couldn't relate to people, and people couldn't relate to me in the neighborhood. And I started to stress out about this so much that I lost aim of my original question, original prompt. Just start small and ask them. Because when you ask a child a question, you open up the receptors for trust in such a skeptical world. You find out what they're about, what they orbit and what orbits them. You'll find out things like how a child still thinks about their grandma who passed away years ago, how their brothers eat carrots and their sister only likes kale. You'll find out something given that a child don't know much, but is eager to find out because of their inherent curiosity and imagination. Now, it's curiosity that my mentor, Mr. Marisa, taught me is the reason that a garden is just a landscape until it's inhabited. How the birds and the worms and even the squirrels and people too come together again and back into a garden. It's imagination that works as ground, and it's curiosity that cultivates the garden. And because of these two things, it's the reason why a garden becomes an alternative venue for so many opportunities. It's a venue where you can make mistakes and not be penalized for failure. Simple cause and effect with a lesson in patience. It's a venue that's inherently therapeutic. So we worked with school counselors to do one-on-one and group activities with students to engage and mitigate their stress, help them to work better with one another. It's a venue where students can claim their own domain. Now, the power of imagination is so much so that no matter what I did as a garden manager, it's going to be imagination that defines what that space really means to a child. Granted, I'm working with ages 5 to 10. But as students became more familiar with this space and became interested in space, realizing they can take ownership of this space, then it's that imagination that's going to define the sense of what this garden means to them and a sense of pride behind it. In which case, they don't just develop a space where they grow food and learn out of, they develop a space where they commune out of too. And it's a venue that develops leaders. Now, if we as educators are interested in developing the next generation of leaders, then why aren't we diffusing out some of that responsibility? And I don't mean like delegating classroom chores. No, I mean like real decision making. So when I was able to get rid of my possessiveness and direction and allow a student to really do what they wanted to do, I was able to do things like this, we were able to do things like this. Youth-led projects such as a farm stand, where students are harvesting produce, marketing it, and donating it to families of the school. Or other things like the fourth graders giving lessons and tours of the garden to the kindergarten. And changing minds begins simply by just engaging the world in a different way. And because of this, a garden is a completely different environment compared to the conventional classroom. In the garden, all the senses of a child's brain are engaged, in which case they can flex their creative and critical thought muscles, and develop a sense of self-efficacy as they watch bees pass by and come to be trusting and safe around them, or watching their first tomato of the season grow and tasting it. It's so sweet. But I do want to say this. Gardens are not the only answer, especially not to these problems. No, a garden is just another tool in the toolbox. It can be substituted by any other thing that provides a similar sense of opportunity. But the thing is it does provide free and healthy food, and it does instill that sense of connection to the land that I believe many Americans are missing these days. But as hopeful as this is, I do need to end on this point, that sometimes education feels like a rainbow to me. Like there's this sense of promise that if we follow it, we'll figure out something. Now, no matter what is being done in a classroom or what a school is able to achieve, the question is, why are we even experiencing these problems in the first place? Behind every symptom, there is a much larger disorder. And it's not like this disorder of cultural intolerance or political and economic oppression are new. No, but what is new is how it perpetuates into today's society. As Christopher Umdeen in his book, To All the White Folks Who Want to Teach in the Hood, states, today's schools still resemble the American Indian boarding schools of the early 1900s, an assimilation of culture. And while a garden can be a space to learn and commune out of, it can be a space for students, really it's just another space for them to cope with the middle-class American way of life in which perhaps they just can't relate to and constantly feel quieted by. So how can we actually teach a person if we deny who they are? And how can that person really develop a sense of themselves if they have no idea who they are? So we as educators have to ask ourselves, what are we really trying to cultivate? Our own self-image in our students? Or a student's full honesty and image and identity? But I'm not an expert. I'm just a student in the back of the classroom. Take it as a grain of salt. Laughter clears the mind. Thank you very much.